is a picture of Jim Morrison. Dark, very dark, because he did have a dark side.
Now,
Grace Slick, the legendary voice of Jefferson Airplane, turned 85 in 2024, and she's still got stories that can shake up the rock world. One of her wildest tales is about Jim Morrison, the mysterious frontman of the Doors. These two icons crossed paths in the late 1960s, a time when rock music was loud, free, and full of rebellion. Grace recently shared some jaw-dropping details about her time with Jim, and it's the kind of story that makes you wonder what really went on behind the scenes of those psychedelic days. It's not just about music. It's about two larger-than-life personalities colliding in a way that left a mark on her, even all these years later. Back in 1968, Jefferson Airplane and the Doors were touring Europe together. It was a big deal. Two of the hottest bands from America's counterculture scene hitting the road, playing sold-out shows and living the rock and roll dream. Grace was already a star, known for her powerful voice and songs like White Rabbit that defined the era. Jim, with his wild hair and unpredictable energy, was the Lizard King, a poet-turned-singer who could hypnotize a crowd. They were both rebels, both deep into the free love, drug-fueled vibe of these 60s. But when they met, it wasn't just about sharing a stage. It got personal. Grace remembers the first time she really noticed Jim. It was 1967, before the Europe tour, at the Tropicana Motel in West Hollywood. She was there with her bandmate Paul Kantner, walking down the hall after a gig. Out of nowhere, there was Jim Morrison, stark naked, high on acid, and barking like a dog. Not howling, not singing, just barking, down on all fours like some wild animal. Paul didn't even blink. He just stepped over Jim and kept walking to his room. Grace, though, couldn't look away. She thought it was hilarious and strange, but it stuck with her. That was Jim, beautiful, crazy, and totally out of control. Fast forward to 1968, and the two bands were on tour together. They played big shows in places like London and Amsterdam, feeding off the energy of the crowds and the chaos of the times. Grace had seen Jim perform before, but being around him day after day was different. She liked him. Most women did. He was gorgeous, with those dark eyes and that leather-clad swagger. But he was also screwy, as she put it. Half the time, you couldn't even talk to him. He'd be lost in his own world, strung out on whatever he'd taken that day. Acid, booze, pot, coke, you name it. Grace wasn't exactly sober herself back then, but Jim took it to another level. One night in London, at the Belgravia Hotel, Grace decided to take a chance. She'd been watching Jim, feeling that pull so many women felt. So she went to his room. She knocked on the door, using Jefferson Airplane's secret knock, a little rhythm they all knew. Jim didn't know it, of course, but he opened the door anyway, flashing that famous smile. What happened next was pure 60s madness. They didn't just hook up. They turned the room into a playground. Strawberries, grapes, whatever fruit the hotel had left out, they smeared it on each other, laughing and rolling around like kids. Grace called it like making love to a floating art form with eyes. She said Jim was well-built, bigger than average, and she wasn't shy about admitting she enjoyed it. But here's where it gets bittersweet. After that wild night, Grace left his room and said, "Call me if you want." She wasn't clingy. She was Grace Slick after all, a woman who lived by her own rules. But Jim never called. Not the next day, not ever. She laughed about it later, saying, "Apparently, I'm a terrible lay." It had stung a little, though. She'd felt something, even if it was just a spark in the heat of the moment. Jim, though? He just moved on, lost in his own haze. Grace didn't hold a grudge. She knew he was too far gone to care about anyone for long. That wasn't the end of their story, though. Later on the tour, in Amsterdam, they had another moment. The bands were hanging out, and someone scored a chunk of Lebanese gold hashish. Grace and the airplane crew offered some to Jim. While most of them pocketed it for later, Jim didn't wait. He sat down on the curb and ate a huge piece right there, chasing it with whatever else fans had handed him. Pot, hash, pills, who knows? That night, during Jefferson Airplane's set, Jim stumbled on stage. He started singing with Grace, wrapping his arms around her, swaying like they were in some dreamy dance. The crowd went wild, but then Jim danced off stage, back to the dressing room, and passed out cold. Grace thought it was funny, but she also saw the warning signs. He was a mess. Grace wasn't surprised when Jim died in 1971. He was only 27, found dead in a Paris apartment, probably from a mix of drugs and alcohol. She'd lost other friends to that life, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, but Jim's death hit different. She'd always thought it was a miracle he made it that far. He used himself as a human guinea pig, she said, testing how much a brain and body could take. Grace loved drugs too. Acid was her thing, and she wrote White Rabbit under its spell, but she had limits. Jim didn't. He'd shove anything into his system, anytime, anywhere. Grace once said she never freaked out on acid because she didn't have psychological problems to start with. Jim, though? She figured he was running from something darker. Years later, when Grace sobered up in the 90s, she started painting. Guess who showed up in her art? Jim Morrison. She did a full-body portrait of him, shirtless, arms out like a rock and roll Jesus. Another sketch, called Pretty Boy, captured his face, those sharp cheekbones and brooding eyes. She didn't paint him out of bitterness. I liked Jim, she said. He was gorgeous but so screwy. It was her way of keeping him alive, a nod to that wild night and the wild man she couldn't forget. Even at 85, talking about him brought out her old punk spirit, that mix of humor and rebellion that made her a legend. Their fling wasn't some big romance. It was a flash, a crazy moment in a crazy time. But it says a lot about who they were. Grace was bold, fearless, always ready to push boundaries. Jim was a storm, beautiful and destructive, pulling people in and then slipping away. Together, they were like fire and gasoline, burning bright for one night. Grace exposed more than just the details of their hookup. She showed us Jim unfiltered, through her eyes. A guy who howled at the moon, smeared strawberries on hotel walls, and lived like every day was his last. And for her, at 85, it's still a story worth telling. That Europe tour wasn't just about music or sex, though. It was a snapshot of the 60s at their peak. Jefferson Airplane and the Doors were more than bands. They were symbols of a generation saying no to rules, no to war, no to anything that didn't feel free. Grace and Jim fit right into that. She'd plot to spike Nixon's tea with LSD a couple years later, and Jim would get arrested for flashing a crowd. They weren't saints. They were rock stars, living loud and messy. That night in London with the strawberries and the laughter was them in their element. Grace's life didn't end with the 60s, of course. She kept singing, first with Jefferson Airplane, then Jefferson Starship, even into the 80s with hits like Why Build This City. She hated that song, by the way, called it a mistake from her sober years. But the wild Grace, the one who raced cars and wrestled cops, never really went away. She just channeled it differently. By the time she quit music, she'd seen it all: fame, drugs, loss. Jim didn't get that chance. He burned out fast, leaving behind myths and mysteries. Looking back, Grace doesn't sugarcoat it. She calls rock and roll people spoiled brats, obsessed with fun, money, and who they could sleep with. She was one of them, and she owns it. Her night with Jim was just one piece of that life, but it's the one she keeps bringing up, even now. Maybe because it was so raw, so real. Or maybe because Jim was the ultimate what could have been, a guy she clicked with, but never got to know. At 85, she's still got that spark, still ready to shock us with a story that's equal parts funny, dirty, and a little sad. The world's changed since 1968. The hippie days are long gone, and most of the icons from back then are either dead or faded. Grace is one of the last standing, a living link to a time when music could start a revolution. Her Jim Morrison story isn't just gossip, It's a window into that era, into two people who lived it harder than most. She's not spilling tea to trash him. She's painting a picture, messy and wild, just like they were. And at 85, she's still got the guts to tell it like it is. Grace Slick's memory of Jim Morrison isn't just a one-night tale. It's layered with all the chaos and color of the I-60s rock scene. After that wild night in London, their paths kept crossing on the Europe tour, and every encounter added a new brushstroke to her picture of him. She didn't chase him or pine for more, but she couldn't help noticing how he moved through the world, like a comet, bright and doomed to crash. At 85, looking back, she's blunt about it. Jim was a genius, a lunatic, and a walking disaster, all rolled into one. Take the Amsterdam show, for instance. That moment when Jim crashed Jefferson Airplane's set wasn't planned. It was pure Morrison. Grace was belting out a song, probably Somebody to Love, when he staggered on stage, high as a kite from that Lebanese gold hash he'd gobbled down. He grabbed her, started singing, or slurring, right into the mic with her. His arms were around her waist, his head swaying like he was about to fall over. The crowd lost it, screaming and cheering, feeding off the madness. Grace didn't push him off. She went with it, matching his energy for a minute. Then he spun away, danced off stage, and collapsed in the dressing room. She remembers laughing about it later with her bandmates, but there was an edge to it. He's not gonna last, she thought, even then. Jim's unpredictability wasn't just a party trick. It was who he was. Grace saw it up close, night after night. One minute, he'd be charming, reciting poetry in that deep voice of his. The next, he'd be screaming at a roadie or passed out in a corner. She'd been around plenty of wild characters. Her own band wasn't exactly tame, but Jim stood out. He didn't just live on the edge. He leapt off it over and over. Grace liked that about him, even if it scared her a little. She was no stranger to pushing limits herself. Acid trips, arrests, all part of her story. But she always came back to earth. Jim didn't seem to want to. Off stage, he was just as intense. Grace remembers a night in Germany, after a show, when the bands were crashing at some cheap hotel. She was in the lobby, smoking a cigarette, when Jim came stumbling in, shirtless and ranting about Nietzsche, or some other philosopher he was obsessed with. He saw her, grinned, and plopped down next to her, still talking a mile a minute. She didn't say much, just listened, nodding along. He smelled like whiskey and sweat, and his eyes were glassy, but there was something magnetic about him. He could have been a professor, she said later, if he wasn't so busy trying to kill himself. That mix of brilliance and self-destruction fascinated her. Their fling in London didn't repeat itself, though. Grace wasn't the type to beg for attention, and Jim wasn't the type to give it. She'd catch his eye sometimes, across a room, backstage, in a van, and he'd flash that smile. But that was it. She didn't mind. "I got my piece of him," she said with a shrug. For her it was enough, a memory to tuck away, like a souvenir from a crazy trip. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Jim was slipping away, even back then. He wasn't just wild, he was fragile, like a glass sculpture teetering on a ledge. The tour wrapped up, and the bands went their separate ways. Jefferson Airplane kept climbing, riding the wave of hits and hippie fame. The Doors did, too, for a while, until Jim's spiral got worse. Grace heard the stories. Arrests, canceled shows, fights with his own band. She wasn't shocked when the news broke in '71 that he'd died. She was in San Francisco, probably painting or jamming with Paul Kantner, when someone told her. "Paris, huh?" she said. Figures he'd go out somewhere fancy. She didn't cry. She'd seen it coming, but she felt the weight of it. Another light from her world, snuffed out too soon. Decades later, when Grace started talking about Jim again, it wasn't to settle scores or dig up dirt. She was 85, living quietly in Malibu, painting and reflecting on a life that could fill 10 books. Her voice was raspier now, her hair silver, but her mind was sharp as ever. She'd tell the Morrison story at art shows or in interviews, always with that sly grin. He was a nutcase, she'd say, but a gorgeous one. She didn't romanticize him. He wasn't some tragic hero to her. He was just Jim, the guy who barked like a dog and turned a hotel room into a fruit-stained mess. Her paintings of him say more than her words ever could. That full-body portrait, with Jim's arms outstretched, captures the way he'd command a stage, like he was daring the universe to take him down. The pretty boy sketch zooms in on his face, all shadows and angles, a hint of that lost look she'd seen in his eyes. Grace didn't paint him to mourn him. She painted him because he was part of her story. A small part, maybe, but one that stuck. "I don't miss him," she said once. "I miss the 60s. He was just there." The thing is, Grace and Jim were cut from the same cloth, even if their threads unraveled differently. They both thrived in that lawless, mind-bending era. Her with her acid-laced lyrics, him with his shamanic stage antics. They both loved the rush of breaking rules. She once tried to dose the president. He got busted for exposing himself in Miami. But Grace had a knack for survival. She quit drugs, quit music, found a new life in art. Jim didn't, or couldn't. At 85, she sees that difference clear as day. "I knew when to stop," she said. He didn't. Their story isn't some epic love affair. It's a footnote in the bigger tale of rock's golden age. But it's a hell of a footnote. Grace exposing Jim isn't about spilling secrets. It's about peeling back the myth. He wasn't just the lizard king or the tortured poet. He was a guy who ate hash on a curb, danced with her on stage, and left strawberry stains on a hotel bed. He was human, flawed, funny, and falling apart. And Grace, at 85, is still here to tell it, with no filter and no regrets. That Europe tour, with its smoky venues and late-night madness, feels like a lifetime ago. Most of the people who were there, fans, roadies, musicians, are gone now. Grace is one of the few left, a witness to a time when music was a weapon, a drug, a religion. Her Jim Morrison story isn't just about him, it's about her too. About the woman who matched his fire for a night, then kept burning long after he flickered out. At 85, she's still got that edge, still ready to laugh at the absurdity of it all. And Jim? He's still the screwy, gorgeous ghost in her rearview mirror.